joining me right now to hopefully provide some clarity, for I am not a lawyer. I just play one on the radio. He is, however, a lawyer extraordinaire, Jeff O'Brien. Good morning, buddy. How are you?
Good morning. Glad to be on.
Man, to break all this down, to figure out how these different scenarios the DFL has created, it is not an easy task. But I want to get your opinion on the way you think the Supreme Court may go on these issues. So let's start off on the issue of majority and quorums. Senate Democrats believe that the actions taken by the Republican colleagues during the opening day of the session earlier this week were improper and unlawful. They've asked the Minnesota Supreme Court to declare them as such. The House is currently divided, 67 Republicans, 66 Democrats, with one vacancy, which will be filled via a special election in the coming weeks or months, depending on the outcome of another Supreme Court ruling coming down the line. Given the GOP's one-seat advantage, Republicans elected Lisa Demuth as Speaker. According to the Minnesota Constitution, a majority must be present in order for the House to conduct business. Republicans say 67 members constitutes a majority because there were only 133 members when the new legislative session began. Conversely, the Democrats, including Secretary of State Steve Simon, say the presence of 68 members is required because the chamber has 134 seats. So there's going to be a hearing today regarding this. No word on how quickly the Minnesota Supreme Court might rule. What do you make of the DFL's argument, and is there any way to speculate on which way this left-leaning Minnesota Supreme Court may go and rule?
Well, first of all, John, in terms of the argument, I mean, I've read the provision, I've read some of the commentary about it. It says majority of members present. Right now, the Minnesota House of Representatives consists of 133 members. And that's because there was one person who won an election in November of last year that a court determined was ineligible to be running in that district because they didn't reside there. So it seems to me a majority of 133. I mean, I'm no math expert, but that would be 67. And so I think that the Secretary of State was wrong. I think that the DFL has been wrong in saying that you need 68 for a quorum. You need 68 to pass bills. There's no question about that.
Right.
But you need 67 to constitute a quorum in this instance. So for these, until there's a new member that has been elected in District 40B, I believe that the Republicans were within their rights to do what they did earlier this week in electing a speaker and a sergeant at arms and a clerk.
Now, if there's two parts of this I want to tackle next. First off, the second part we'll talk about in a moment is the precedent that gets set if the Minnesota State Supreme Court actually goes and they rule that 68 is what's required for a quorum. So let's get to that, the second part. The first part is, though, listen, even if they do go and rule that, the DFL is back to where they were before. You just mentioned it. Because they've already said they're not going to go back unless there's a power sharing agreement. So we're back to square one again. Basically, it would wipe out what the GOP has done so far this week in the 2 days of the opening days of the legislative session. But I'm hesitant to believe that they would go and show up for work because they still don't have the majority until that election takes place. So we're just back to them boycotting. It's kind of, apart from establishing whether or not 68 is required for a quorum, in terms of the way the DFL is conducting themselves, it's kind of irrelevant beyond the outcome of the 40B election.
Yeah, if they so the worst case scenario here for Republicans is they remain tied, right? Because the 40B seat, most are believing that the Democrats will hold that seat because the person who won and then was ruled ineligible won by like 30 points. Now, every election's different. Special elections can be different. You never know what the circumstances might be. But, if you had to be betting on it, it's likely going to hold as a DFL seat. So then you're back to the 67 tie. And that's what the Democrats are pushing on for this power sharing agreement, which to me first of all, how abhorrent is it that this is the big concern is a power sharing agreement? Aren't they? All these folks are supposed to be, serving their constituents, not worrying about power. But that's a separate issue. So yeah, if the court rules that quorum is 68, then the DFL just says, fine, let's go do our power sharing agreement. So since we're going to be tied, or likely going to be tied, or you need one of us to show up.
Right.
We're not going to show up unless we get our power sharing agreement. But and in terms of handicapping what might happen, then there's the separate lawsuit with the calling of the special election. And
let's go. Let's go to that. There was a hearing that took place yesterday. I watched some of the arguments of Ryan Wilson that he was making that Tim Walz was premature in calling that, because that election, as the GOP did at the House earlier this week, they declared that seat vacant in 40B, and the way that it's supposed to work is in the House then determines when that special election will occur, not Tim Walz. But Tim Walz went and declared the 28th as the special election date, and that's what's being debated now and was debated yesterday.
Yeah, so I do believe that the governor jumped the gun on calling it this silliness of the guy resigning from a seat that he never held and was ineligible to run for as the trigger for calling the special election. That was a stretch for me. But I heard some of the I read some of the stories and heard some of the commentary from the case yesterday, from the hearing yesterday. I think if I had to predict on that one, I think that the court may come out and say, here's what the law is, but given the circumstances and voters are already voting, we're going to let it slide on this one. I think I could see them doing that on this one, because there was some of the questions about that. Well, they're already voting. Isn't this going to prejudice, what's going on now? So I think they could. I'm not confident that they're going to somehow call a new election. They're going to probably let that one and its results stand. In terms of the other case involving the quorum issue, again, it seems to me pretty clear, but I'm not really confident in what this Supreme Court may rule, because they're 100% appointed by Democrat governors, and I just worry that in this day and age, there was a time where whether it was Democrat or Republican, the law was the law, and it didn't matter what your party was, it didn't matter what the political consequences were. You ruled that way. It happened many years ago. That's how Arnie Carlson kind of ended up on the ballot running against Rudy Ferpich 30 plus years ago, because a DFL Chief Justice went against the Democrat governor, and as I understand, they never spoke to each other again. But they ruled what the law was. In this day and age, with everything so politicized, and especially with, in my opinion, Governor Walz's picks, some of them have been pretty partisan. I mean, something like I think one was like his counsel that he used to help justify some of the actions during the COVID lockdowns and things like that. Yeah, I just don't see them, that type of justice, ignoring the partisan and the political fallout from a ruling. So I would say I'm not confident. I'm hopeful, but I'm not confident that they're going to go the right way on this one.
Is there a mechanism? So again, I'm going to get into more details of this later on. I've broken this all down, and I want to try to make sense of it for you listening this morning, so you know the various ways this can play out. And all of this, and by the way, and all of this points back to how I'm definitely of the opinion that Governor Tim Walz intentionally prematurely called for that special election, knowing full well it was going to be contested. I don't think there's any doubt. There's no doubt in my mind that that's the reason why he went in and did that, because it provides the opportunity for what's taking place now to slow everything up. The next question I have for you, lawyer extraordinaire Jeff O'Brien, is Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the Minnesota State Supreme Court rules in favor of Walz, and they find that what he did in calling for the special election on the 28th to be justifiable. We're not that many days away now from the 28th, right? As of Monday, we'll be 8 days away. Is there an argument they could make or something that they could do to potentially kick the can down the road on the issue, on the quorum issue, and delay that until after the election? Meaning give the DFL the excuse to continue their boycott, saying we're waiting for the state Supreme Court to make their decision. The election goes through. They win that election. And suddenly now the quorum issue is no longer relevant because they're back to 67-67 regardless. And then the Supreme Court could actually go and just rule that the statute is as it is and a majority is a majority. Is there a mechanism where they could delay this?
I think the court's going to have to say something, John, because you're talking about, regardless of what happens in the 40B special election, the bottom line is that, earlier this week, 67 members of the Minnesota House got together and elected a speaker and a clerk and a sergeant at arms. And if you're in that, and the Republican side is going to say that those were legitimate elections. We had a quorum. We had the authority to do that, regardless of Secretary of State Steve Simon, gaveling them out and saying they didn't, right? And the Democrats are going to continue to say you didn't have that authority. Even if they come back in as a 67-67 tie, someone's going to have to rule on what happened earlier this week and whether or not there was authority to do that. I think that the court is going to have to. I think it's going to be harder to punt on that piece of it versus, like I said, finding what the law is, but saying no harm, no foul. The special election can continue as scheduled. But going forward, here's the rule. I think it's harder to do that on the quorum issue because someone's going to have to rule on what happened this week.
Well, and listen, Walter Hudson laid this out. I want to mention this briefly. If the court comes back and says, and I'm working off of what Walter had posted on X, if the court comes back and says that there's no quorum without 68, no matter what this would mean is that any future tie can result in an indefinite suspension of the legislature. It means that a disaster resulting in the deaths of several members could empower a minority to suspend the legislature. It means a single vacancy can prevent the state government from functioning. Again, you can't pass bills unless you have 68, but you can sort of set the stage and the agenda and pick the speaker with a majority based off of that. Such a ruling would hobble our constitutional order, to say nothing of ignoring the explicit legislative intent of our framers. What we're about to find out is whether the Minnesota Supreme Court is willing to hobble the House as an institution in perpetuity to provide an immediate win to their friends. Any comments on what Walter laid out?
Well, that's why he's my state representative. And I agree with him 100%. I mean, that is the issue, and that's what I hope that the state Supreme Court is part of their calculation, not just, well, if we rule this way, then Lisa Damoth is speaker and the Republicans are in leadership. I hope they consider the various scenarios as to what the consequences are of finding that the quorum is 68 members for the reasons that you just listed there from in Walter's comments. It's a big problem going forward in terms of the operation of the Minnesota House if it's determined that a quorum is 68 members versus a majority of those present.
And again, I just want to point this out, and then I have a question that came in for you, lawyer extraordinaire Jeff O'Brien. But just to establish this again, even if the state Supreme Court quickly rules that 68 is needed for a quorum, the House DFL still can't return to the Capitol before the special election in 40B, because if they do, the GOP will still have the majority of 67-66, and therefore they can just go and do everything they've done the last 2 days.
Yeah. I agree.
It's a mess.
That's why they're staying away. And then I thought it was cute the little swearing in ceremony they did as a way of trying to justify getting their paychecks. Again, really glad that service is first and foremost among a good chunk of our representatives in the Minnesota House.
Here's my other conspiracy on that, Jeff. I think that nobody's talking about the super secret ceremony, and anymore. Like, that just completely dropped off of the conversation and commentary from the media. I'm convinced that that's another insurance policy for the DFL to continue to delay this whole charade. Because since nobody is talking about it, nobody's challenged it yet. And depending on how the Minnesota Supreme Court rules, if suddenly now the issue of pay comes into play, say the Supreme Court doesn't go the way that they want them to go on quorum, and they're still boycotting, and the GOP moves to deny the DFL House members their pay, and this ends up resulting in a lawsuit, that just delays things further. So I'm convinced that they did that again just to bring about more complications and chaos and delay this for as long as they can. And it really all hinges upon that 40B seat, which, of course, is heavily favored to go to the DFL anyways, because Curtis Johnson won doing that thing with my fingers by 30 points in that race.
Yeah. And then, depending on what happens over on the Senate side going forward with Senator Mitchell and her trial, and if she resigns and is a special, we could be going through all of this again over in the Senate. So yeah, it's fun times. I guess given how much I've had to advise clients as to what the trifecta did to all our law changes here in the last couple of years, I'm not too upset that they're not over there passing things.
This is true.
Yeah.
I mean, because I'm with you on that.
At least we've stopped the bleeding in terms of some of the ridiculous laws that are being passed in this state. But it's a little bit it's quite comical. I should mention, full disclosure, that the lawsuit that started this whole chaotic ball rolling was brought by a colleague of mine at Hush Blackwell, and and you know that because we've talked about it off the air. We represented the plaintiff in the 40B election challenge, but I can tell you in trying to war game what would happen afterwards, we didn't see the DFL walking out and having their super secret ceremony and doing all of this kind of stuff. So, but it keeps us lawyers busy when our elected officials are suing each other in court all the time.
Let me sneak in this question with about a minute left, Jeff O'Brien.
John, could you ask your guest how the Supreme Court has standing or the authority to adjudicate an internal House organization? Where does the executive branch get that authority to meddle in another branch of government?
John, that's a very good question. It would be the executive branch. It would be the judicial branch. Would be the courts. But yeah, I mean that's ultimately another argument that the House Republicans have is we don't care what you say.
Right.
It's ultimately for the House to make the determination. That's the argument that's being made right now over the Shakopee seat. Is regardless of what the court found that the election was valid, we ultimately decide that, right? And then they're saying they weren't going to seat Representative Tabke. But it is true that the Minnesota House determines, some of these issues for itself. So this is, you hear the term constitutional crisis. Well, Minnesota, guess what? We're looking at one right now.
Yeah, we're in the middle of one, and it's all the DFL's doing. Lawyer extraordinaire Jeff O'Brien, I'll expect that bill for your services in the mail soon. And thank you for the time this morning, buddy.
Thanks for having me on, John.